Planes are giant monsters made from metal and electronics, used by the majority of us for travel. It's these aircraft that have for many years remained the fastest means of transport, until Hyperloop and space tourism can be counted. And apparently flights open up the whole world to us. For example, you can fly from London to New York in the space of 6 or 7 hours, although in actual fact much more time is required. You have to arrive at the airport in advance. There's queues at customs and registration desks, endless scans, and passengers, documents, and luggage to check. Add waiting to be seated, flight delays, and add frequent acts of God to that. After all that, you climb on board and spend 7 hours at a height of 10,000 meters in a small seat with crying children and rude passengers at your side. And at this point, your nerves are already at their limit. In 1985, one 24-year-old Norwegian decided to have a little drink before his flight to relieve the tension. His flight from Trondheim to Oslo should have taken about an hour. After getting a bit tipsy from beer, the former convict remembered all the hardships of prison life, and the alcohol strengthened his pain and malice nature. During those years, safety precautions on Norway's internal flights clearly didn't take up too much of the passengers' time and nerves like they do now. And the drunk man took advantage of this. After climbing on board, the tipsy Norwegian took his pistol and took control of the plane and its 120 passengers. He demanded a meeting with the Prime Minister and the Minister of Justice to discuss his terrible treatment during prison. All the while, the aircraft flew to Oslo. The hijacker made a base in one of the toilets and demanded that flight attendants bring him alcohol. After landing in their designated spot, the former convict released the passengers but kept the flight crew as hostages. Police immediately arrived to the airplane. Its staff offered the criminal some more beer in exchange for his gun, and the malicious terrorist agreed to the deal with pleasure. This was the first hijacking of a plane in Norway's history. But the drunk hijacker only impersonated a real flight hijacker. The first known hijacking of a commercial airplane in the world was carried out by 4 Chinese men in 1948, and on that occasion, the ending wasn't so happy. Modern safety measures in airports started appearing only in the 1970s. The strictest limits were introduced after the 9/11 terrorist attack in the USA. But now, let's push back time and consider a flight that took place on July 16, 1948. A small seaplane was headed from Macau, then still a Portuguese colony, to Hong Kong. Before they got on board the Miss Macau, not one of the 23 passengers underwent checks or even went through border control. Among them were citizens from the US, Great Britain, Russia, Portugal, and 12 Chinese people. It turned out that included among the passengers were a famous jockey, the head of a wandering circus, a worker for the Coca-Cola Company, and Huang Song-ping, a millionaire and trader in gold. The businessman had missed his ferry and decided to fly by this route. On board were also 4 Chinese men in suits and hats. When members of the flight crew completed preparations, Miss Macau started its 20-minute flight. But the plane never showed at Hong Kong Airport and didn't make contact with its dispatcher. A local fisherman had noticed it fall into a river. The tragic accident was predated by 3 men's decision to get rich quick. The first few flight hijackings were committed exclusively with the goal of robbery. They knew about the businessman in Macau who would transfer gold on the aircraft. The main characters of the story came up with a plan: take control of the airplane, rob the passengers, and then also demand a ransom for them. But they weren't hardened criminals and didn't know the local area. So they took a 4th accomplice into their team, Huang Yu. Other versions of his transliterated name are Wang or Huan. The man was a local farmer and wonderfully adept in geography. He was only supposed to guide the hijacked plane and guide it to an obscured place. The 3 organizers, who were surnamed Zhao, took the most important part of the mission on themselves, hijacking the aircraft. Each one fastened a pistol to the inner side of their thigh and hid bullets in the heels of their shoes. In 2001, the Islamic extremist Richard Reed used a similar trick to bring an explosive on board. That day, Miss Macau was piloted by 27-year-old American Dale Kramer and 23-year-old Australian officer Ken McDuff. Neither of them was supposed to be on board the vessel on July 16th. Kramer replaced the first pilot, who was off with an ear infection, and McDuff was called to replace an officer who the evening before had fallen into water while parking a plane. Almost immediately after takeoff, the 3 strangely dressed Chinese men started fidgeting in their seats. Out of the blue, they retrieved their pistols, and 2 of them went off to the pilot's cabin, while the third remained to frighten the passengers. In broken English, the flight hijackers forced the pilots to surrender. Surprised by such audacity, they refused to carry out their orders. The situation continued to differ from the hijackers' plan when their important passenger struck the third criminal, taking his pistol from him. This brave man became the Chinese men's first victim. Noticing the ruckus in the passenger section, the 2 hijackers returned from the cabin and started shooting at him. Officer McDuff decided to retaliate and jumped on one of the criminals. He managed to strike him on the head, but in response, the other Chinese man opened fire. One of the bullets crossed paths with the head of Dale Kramer, who was then at the wheel. The pilot died instantly, falling on the steering apparatus. Miss Macau took a sharp dip and dropped into the mouth of the Zhu Wang River. The force with which it hit the water was so great that the nose was torn from the plane. The nose then collided with the fuselage, causing the tail to come off the aircraft. A local fisherman saw the accident and headed for the site of tragedy, where he picked up a sole survivor, who turned out to be Huang Yu. The remaining passengers and members of the flight staff had died. The lucky survivor was brought to hospital with fractured limbs. All attention was fixed on Huang Yu. Only he could tell them what happened on board. And while the man told bold lies, experts searched the remains of the plane. The surviving criminal claimed that during the flight, the aircraft's nose had unexpectedly caught fire. Because of its sharp decrease in height, Huang Yu had supposedly lost consciousness and couldn't even remember how he came round in the hospital. He also claimed that he, the poor farmer, had showed up on board because he was looking for work. He had traveled to Macau without result until he had met a person by the name of Zhuo, who had hired him as an apprentice mechanic in Hong Kong and bought him a ticket. That's why he, Hunang Yu, was included in those on board Miss Macau. In his first conversation with the police, they noticed an extremely unlikely detail. The problem was that the amphibious aircraft was so well designed that even when both its motors failed, it could still descend onto the water through gliding. The aircraft belonged to the air company Cathay Pacific Airways, which even now remains the flagship of Chinese air transportation. In Macau, there was no aerodrome at the time, and the local firm Macau Air Transport used a seaplane from the Hong Kong side. During the Second World War, the company had halted flights, but in 1948, it restarted its transportation of passengers and gold. During this period, there was an active embargo on the precious metal, and Macau was the sole seller's market in the Far East. Local air companies therefore preferred quality transports for their routes. Police weren't satisfied with Huang Yu's story. Firstly, they'd retrieved fragments of the plane and bodies of those who hadn't survived from the river. Both had been riddled by bullets. Secondly, when they found the Chinese man, he was in a life jacket, which he should have been wearing if the vessel had actually suddenly dropped and he'd lost consciousness. Thirdly, Huang Yu couldn't answer a single question about the work he was meant to be undertaking. Fourthly, witnesses had appeared in the case who at approximately the same time in the area had heard sounds similar to gunfire. And in the end, the police made checks on the farmer and his supposed collaborators, after which they arrested the man. But, of course, he was in no hurry to give a wholehearted confession. Miss Macau being hijacked and crashed was an unprecedented event. In 1948, the incident was called air piracy. Police put as much effort as possible into making Huang talk, although now the methods used by them seem, at the very least, strange. The suspect was situated in a hospital with numerous fractures, so they set up recording devices in his ward and sent agents in secret. Investigators went undercover, pretending to be patients and taking beds next to Huang Yu. The police also showed unusual creativity. For greater believability and conspiracy, they covered one of their undercover workers in pig's blood. His story was that he ended up in a car accident and was seriously wounded. All this to get proof of the surviving Chinese man's participation in the flight hijacking. How and why Huang Yu, who was put under observation, let the cat out of the bag, no one knows. Some claim that the police showed the Chinese man a false newspaper clipping, from which he learned that his conspirators had survived and were already giving proof. This urged the farmer to tell his own version of the tale. According to different sources, the criminal boasted about the plane hijacking in front of his ward neighbors, that is, in front of undercover police. As a result, Huang Yu told them how he was connected to the Zhao trio and had offered to join their wild enterprise. They followed the businessman Huang Songping and knew that he was intending to transport gold bars. The surviving criminal confessed to conspiracy. But the story doesn't end there. The aircraft was in the process of finishing its route between Macau and Hong Kong. The plane belonged to the second side, and the managing company the first. Both regions were colonies at that time, but the incident itself occurred in international airspace, so the Portuguese authorities, who controlled Macau, and Britain, who controlled Hong Kong, couldn't come to an agreement on which rules they should judge Huang Hu by. While they made bureaucratic decisions, the Chinese man withdrew his testimony. The man announced that he was just playing a joke on his neighbor in the hospital ward. Despite the 25 deaths in 1951, Huang walked free due to an absence of any legal claims on at least one government's part. The man returned to his homeland, and his fate after that is unknown. Some sources say that he was killed in a staged car crash, others that he was imprisoned for 4 years. Since that time, the field of civilian aviation has changed beyond recognition. Safety systems in airports are constantly modernized, but certain passengers all the same try to bring on contraband, and sometimes in very original ways. For instance, in 2019, a woman hid more than 20 mice under her skirt to take them from China to Taiwan. If you know any unusual stories about incidents on board an airplane, share them in the comments below.